Jake, you own what? My father's fork clattered against his plate, the sound echoing through our cramped dining room like a gunshot. My sister Emma sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, staring at the property deed I'd just placed next to the mashed potatoes. The same house we were sitting in, the same house Dad had just announced he was leaving to her in his will, had my name printed in bold letters across the top as the legal owner. I'm Jake Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 10 years, my family has treated me like the ultimate disappointment. The college dropout who couldn't hold a real job, who spent his days playing on the computer while my younger sister, Emma, climbed the corporate ladder at one of Columbus's most prestigious law firms. Tonight, at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for Emma's latest promotion to senior associate, everything they believed about their two children was about to crumble. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening had started like every other Sunday dinner at 1247 Maple Street. Mom had made her famous pot roast, the same recipe she'd been perfecting since Emma and I were kids. Dad sat at the head of our old oak table, the one that wobbled slightly. If you leaned too hard on the left side, Emma was radiant in her tailored blazer, fresh from another victory in court. While I sat there in my usual uniform of jeans and a faded t-shirt, looking like I'd just rolled out of bed. The house itself told the story of our family's struggles better than words ever could. The wallpaper in the dining room was peeling at the corners, a remnant from the early 2000s that Mom kept saying she'd replace when we have the money. The hardwood floors creaked in all the familiar places, and the heating system made those settling noises that had become the soundtrack of my childhood. This wasn't the home of a successful middle-class family anymore. This was the home of people who were holding on by their fingernails, trying to maintain dignity while the world shifted around them. Dad had been building up to his announcement all evening. I could see it in the way he kept clearing his throat and glancing at Mom with those meaningful looks married couples share after 34 years together. Mom, for her part, was unusually quiet, picking at her food and avoiding eye contact. With both Emma and me, something was coming, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. "Kids," Dad finally said, setting down his coffee cup with the kind of deliberate motion that meant business was about to be discussed. "Your mother and I have been doing some thinking, some planning for the future." He paused, running his weathered hand through his thinning gray hair. "We're not getting any younger, and we want to make sure everything is taken care of when we're gone." Emma immediately straightened in her chair, her lawyer instincts kicking in. She had always been the responsible one, the one who planned. A head who had her life mapped out in 5-year increments. "Dad, you don't need to worry about that now. You and Mom are healthy. You've got years ahead of you." "That's sweet, honey, but facts are facts," Mom interjected, her voice carrying that tone she'd perfected over years of dealing with difficult parents at the elementary school where she worked as a secretary. "We've been talking to a lawyer about updating our will, making sure our affairs are in order." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not because I was worried about inheritance or money, but because I knew where this conversation was heading. I'd seen the stress lines deepen. Around my parents' eyes over the past few years, I'd noticed Dad's shoulders sagging a little more each time he talked about retirement, about whether they'd have enough saved. I'd watched Mom calculate and recalculate grocery bills, seen her put items back on store shelves when she thought no one was looking. "The thing is," Dad continued, his eyes focusing on Emma while somehow managing to avoid looking at me entirely, "we've decided that the house, our savings, pretty much everything we have, it's all going to Emma." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Emma's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, confusion, then something that looked almost like guilt. "Dad, I don't understand." "What about Jake?" "Jake's a good kid," Dad said, and I could hear the careful diplomacy in his voice. The same tone he'd used when explaining to neighbors why his oldest son had dropped out of college. "But he's still figuring things out. Emma, you've got stability. You've got a career. You understand responsibility. You've proven you can handle this kind of burden." The word burden hit me like a physical blow. Not the inheritance itself, but the casual dismissal, the assumption that I couldn't handle adult responsibilities. After 10 years of this, I think I'd be used to it. You'd think the constant underestimation would have stopped stinging. But sitting there, listening to my father explain why I wasn't worthy of their trust, felt like being 17 again, watching their faces when I told them I was leaving school. "Dad," I said quietly, "before you finalize anything, there's something you should probably know." I reached into the folder I'd brought with me. The one they'd assumed contained whatever freelance web design project I was working on this week, about the house. That's when I placed the deed on the table, right between the green beans and Mom's homemade dinner rolls. The official document that showed Jake Martinez as the sole owner of 1247 Maple Street, Riverside, Ohio, purchased 3 years ago for $127,000. The exact amount my parents had owed when the bank started foreclosure proceedings. The silence that followed was deafening. The deed sat there like an unexploded bomb, its official seal catching the light from Mom's favorite chandelier. Emma was the first to move, reaching across the table with trembling fingers to pick up the document. Her legal training kicked in. As she scanned the paperwork, her eyes moving methodically from line to line, checking dates, signatures, notarizations. "This is real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Jake, this is actually real. You've owned this house for 3 years?" Mom's chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back from the table, her face pale. "That's impossible. We've been paying the mortgage. We've been." She trailed off, the color draining from her cheeks as the implications started to sink. Dad's reaction was different. His face flushed red, the way it always did when he was angry or embarrassed, and his hands clenched into fists on the table. "This is some kind of joke, right? Some computer thing you made up? You can't just buy someone's house without them knowing." "Actually, you can," Emma said softly, still studying the document. "If the property goes into foreclosure proceedings, anyone can purchase it at auction. The new owner can choose to let the previous residents stay as tenants." She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of awe and confusion. "Jake, how did you even know about the foreclosure?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mom and Dad, you never told us you were having financial trouble." The question hung heavy in the air. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that spoke volumes about conversations they'd had behind closed doors, about sleepless nights and worried discussions, about money they thought their children would never need to know about. "We didn't want to worry you kids," Mom said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "It was just a rough patch. Dad's pension wasn't as much as we'd hoped, and with my hours getting cut at the school," she wiped her eyes with her napkin, "we thought we could handle it on our own." "You were 3 months behind on payments," I said gently. "I found out because I'd been helping old Mrs. Patterson down the street with her computer problems. And she mentioned seeing a foreclosure notice posted on your door. I came by that weekend when you were visiting Aunt Linda, and I saw it myself." Dad's face was cycling through emotions I'd rarely seen from him. Shame, confusion, and something. That might have been fear. "So you, decided to swoop in and buy our house out from under us? What kind of son does that to his parents?" "The kind who doesn't want to see them lose everything," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I bought the house at auction and immediately set up the rental agreement to match your old mortgage payments. Same amount, same date, every month. You never missed a payment because you were never behind again." Emma was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "Jake, where did you get $127,000? Last time we talked about money, you were complaining about having to eat ramen for a week." That conversation felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been last Christmas. I'd made some joke about being broke. The same kind of self-deprecating humor I'd been using for years to deflect questions about my income. It was easier to let them think I was struggling than to explain the truth. "The ramen thing was because I was working 80-hour weeks and forgot to grocery shop," I said. "Not because I couldn't afford food." I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the banking app I rarely checked in front of anyone. The screen showed an account balance that made Emma gasp audibly. $2.8 million, she read, out loud, her voice cracking on the numbers. "Jake, what the hell do you do for a living?" Mom had gone completely silent, staring at the phone screen like it was displaying information in a foreign language. Dad was shaking his head slowly, as if he could make the numbers disappear through sheer force of will. I buy properties. I said simply, fix them up, rent them out, sometimes flip them. I started with a duplex I bought with money I made designing websites in college before I dropped out. Lived in one half, rented out the other. Used that income to buy another property, then another. You dropped out to become a real estate investor? Emma asked, incredulity clear in her voice. I dropped out because I was making more money than my professors, I said. My computer science advisor was earning $60,000 a year teaching me things I'd already learned on my own, while I was pulling in twice that creating websites for local businesses. It seemed stupid to keep paying tuition when I could be investing that money instead. The revelation was clearly too much for Dad to process. He stood up abruptly, his chair nearly toppling backward. So for 10 years you've been letting us think you were a failure? You've been sitting there at every family dinner, every holiday, listening to us worry about you? Letting your mother lose sleep wondering if you were going to be okay? His voice was rising with each word, the decades of concern and disappointment, transforming into something closer to anger. Do you have any idea what you put us through? The conversations we've had about whether we should offer to help you with rent, whether we should stage some kind of intervention? Tom, Mom said, quietly reaching for his arm. Sit down, let him explain. But Dad was beyond reasoning. The man who had spent his entire adult life working with his hands, building a modest life through honest labor, was confronting the fact that his supposedly unsuccessful son had amassed more wealth than he'd ever dreamed of. Explain what? That he's been lying to us for a decade. While we were scraping together money for his Christmas presents, he was sitting on millions of dollars. That every time I told people my son was finding himself, he was actually running some kind of empire? It's not an empire, Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It's 47 rental properties across 3 counties. Most of them are small apartments and duplexes, places where working families can afford to live. I'm not some slumlord getting rich off people's misery. Emma was scrolling through the property records on her phone, her legal mind working to verify what I was telling them. Jesus, Jake, you own the apartment complex where my friend Sarah lives, and that row of townhouses on Elm Street, and she looked up at me with wide eyes. You own the building where Derek's law firm has their offices. Mark Walsh was Emma's fiancé. An ambitious attorney who'd made it clear he thought Emma could do better than having a deadbeat brother. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd been paying rent to the same person he'd been dismissing as a loser for the past 2 years. The commercial properties are newer additions, I said. I started focusing on residential real estate, but when opportunities came up to buy office buildings and retail spaces, it made financial sense to diversify. Mom finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us worry all these years? It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer revealed something I wasn't proud of. The truth was more complicated than financial strategy or business decisions. About family dynamics that had been set in stone since we were children, about roles we'd all agreed to play without ever discussing the script. The question hung between us like a chasm that had been years in the making. Mom's eyes were redrimmed with tears she was trying not to shed. I could see the hurt there, the genuine pain of a mother who thought she'd failed her child. It was the same look she'd given me when I'd announced I was dropping out of college, the same expression that had haunted me through countless sleepless nights. Because you never asked, I said finally, the words coming out harsher than I'd intended, not really. You asked if I was okay, if I needed money, if I was eating enough, but you never asked what I was actually doing with my life. You just assumed, Dad scoffed, but there was less heat in it now. We assumed because you never told us anything concrete. When people asked what you did for work, you'd say computer stuff or web design. What were we supposed to think? Maybe that I was being deliberately vague for a reason, I replied. Maybe that I was protecting something instead of hiding from something. Emma set down the property deed and leaned back in her chair, her analytical mind working through the implications. Protecting what, exactly? Jake, I don't understand why you couldn't just tell us you were successful. Why make it some big secret? The answer to that question required going back to the beginning, to the moment when our family roles had been cast in concrete. Emma had always been the achiever, the one who brought home perfect report cards and student council certificates. She was the daughter who made Mom beam with pride at parent-teacher conferences. The one Dad bragged about to his coworkers. She had direction, ambition, a clear path from point A to point B. I'd been different from the start. I was curious about everything. Easily bored with traditional structure, drawn to solving problems in unconventional ways. In elementary school, I'd gotten in trouble for finishing math worksheets in creative ways that technically gave the right answers but didn't follow the prescribed methods. In high school, I'd built a computer from spare parts that outperformed the school's entire lab. But I'd nearly failed English because I couldn't bring myself to write essays about books I found tedious. "Do you remember when I was 16 and I made that website for Thompson's hardware store?" I asked, looking directly at Dad. "Old Mr. Thompson paid me $500, and I was so excited to tell you about it." Dad's expression softened slightly, and I could see him searching his memory for the moment I was describing. "You told me it was nice that I had a little hobby, but I shouldn't let it distract me from my real studies," I continued. "You said I needed to focus on getting into a good college and finding a respectable career." You patted me on the head like I'd built a decent sandcastle. The memory was crystal clear in my mind, even after all these years. I'd burst through the front door that day, practically vibrating with excitement about my first real business. Success, only to have it dismissed as a cute distraction. That was the moment I'd learned that my parents had very specific ideas about what constituted success, and my interests didn't fit their definition. That wasn't Dad started, then stopped. His face was cycling through emotions again, and I could see him trying to remember the conversation from his perspective. "I didn't mean to dismiss you, son. I just wanted you to have security, a stable future." "I know," I said, and I meant it. But Emma got celebrated for every A on her report card, every scholarship application, every step toward becoming a lawyer. When I showed you something I'd created, something that was actually making money, it got labeled as a hobby. The message was pretty clear about which kind of success mattered in this family. Mom was crying openly now, not bothering to hide the tears. "Jake, we never meant to make you feel like your achievements didn't matter. We were just scared for you. The computer thing seemed so uncertain, so risky. We wanted you to have something solid to fall back on. So I learned to keep my wins to myself," I said quietly. "When I made my first $1,000 from web design, I didn't tell you. When I bought my first rental property at 23, I didn't tell you. Every time I hit a new milestone, I'd think about sharing it, but then I'd remember that it would just be another hobby that I needed to be careful not to let distract me from real success." Emma was staring at her hands, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She'd always been perceptive, always good at seeing patterns and connections. "That's why you always seemed so distant at family gatherings," she said slowly. "Why you'd get quiet when people asked about work. You weren't embarrassed about failing. You were tired of being patronized. Your sister brings home a new case victory, and Dad calls everyone he knows to brag about his lawyer daughter," I said. "I buy a 10-unit apartment building, and nobody even knows it happened because I've learned that my definition of success doesn't translate to yours." The room fell silent except for the familiar sounds of our old house settling around us. The heating system kicked on with its usual rattle, and somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed its off-key tune. These were the sounds of my childhood, the backdrop to thousands of family dinners and conversations that had slowly, imperceptibly, driven a wedge between us. "But buying our house," Mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell us about that? We could have thanked you. We could have paid you back properly instead of thinking we were still dealing with the bank. Because the moment I told you I owned it, everything would have changed," I replied. "You would have felt like charity cases. Dad would have insisted on paying me back with interest he couldn't afford. You would have been living in your son's house instead of your own home, and that would have eaten at you both." Dad's shoulders sagged as the truth of that statement hit him. He was a proud man, someone who'd built his life on the principle of earning what he had and paying his own way. The idea of accepting help, even from his own son, would have been almost unbearable. "Instead," I continued, "you gotta keep your dignity. Gotta stay in the home you'd worked 30 years to pay for. The mortgage payments you were making were exactly what you'd been paying before, so it felt like continuity instead of charity. I got to know my parents weren't going to lose everything, and you gotta keep believing you were handling your own problems. Emma stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening street. So for 3 years we've been paying rent to our own son, living in a house he owns, while having conversations about how worried we are about his future. That's about the size of it, I admitted. She turned back to face the table, and there was something different in her expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of frustrated sadness. Jake, do you have any idea how messed up that is? How much it says about our family that you felt like you had to manage all of this in secret? It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding asking myself for years. The truth was, my secrecy had become its own kind of prison. Every family gathering had been an exercise in careful deflection. Every conversation about money had required me to bite my tongue. I'd become an expert at playing the role of the struggling son, even as my real life had grown far beyond anything my parents could have imagined. But before I could respond, the front door opened, with the familiar squeak of hinges that needed oil. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by a voice I'd grown to dislike over the past 2 years. "Hello, Martinez family. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was murder coming back from the courthouse." Derek Walsh had arrived, and something told me the evening was about to get significantly more complicated. Derek Walsh strode into the dining room. With the confident swagger of someone who just won a major case, his expensive suit was perfectly tailored. His silver watch caught the light as he moved. And his smile had that practiced quality that came from years of charming juries and intimidating opposing counsel. He was everything my parents had hoped I would be: accomplished, professional, and undeniably successful by conventional standards. "Emma, darling," he said, leaning down to kiss my sister's cheek before taking in the scene around the table. His eyes swept over the property deed, Mom's tear-stained face, Dad's shell-shocked expression, with the keen observation skills that had made him a formidable attorney. "Did I interrupt something important?" "Derek," Emma said, her voice strained. "You might want to sit down for this." He pulled out the chair next to Emma, his movements precise and controlled. Derek was the kind of man who never did anything without calculating the potential outcomes first. Even his casual gestures seemed rehearsed, as if he'd practiced the most effective way to sit down at a dinner table. "Let me guess," he said with a knowing smirk, glancing at me. "Jake's finally ready to admit he needs help finding a real job? I've told you, Emma. My firm has connections. I could probably get him something entry-level, maybe in the mailroom or doing basic computer support." The condescension in his voice was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. This was how Derek had spoken to me for the entire 2 years he'd been dating Emma. I was a charity case, a problem to be solved through his connections and influence. "Actually," Emma said slowly, "it turns out Jake owns this house. About 47 other properties across 3 counties, including the building where your law firm has its offices." Derek's confident smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. He looked around the table as if waiting for someone to tell him this was an elaborate joke. When no one did, his expression shifted to something between confusion and disbelief. "I'm sorry, what?" said, his lawyer's instincts kicking in as he reached for the property deed. "That's impossible." "Emma, your brother designs websites for small businesses. He drives a 10-year-old Honda and lives in that tiny apartment above the pizza place. He drives a 10-year-old Honda because it's reliable and he doesn't need to impress anyone," Dad said quietly. "Apparently, he can afford whatever he wants." Derek studied the deed with the same intensity he'd probably use reviewing a major contract. His eyes moved across every line, checking signatures and legal language with practiced efficiency. As a lawyer, he knew authentic legal documents when he saw them, and this one was undeniably real. "Jake Martinez," he read aloud, his voice losing its usual confidence. "Sole owner of 1247 Maple Street, Riverside, Ohio. Purchased October 15th, 3 years ago." He looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, Derek seemed genuinely rattled. "You bought your parents' house?" "I bought it when they were facing foreclosure," I said simply. "Same way I bought the Meridian office complex." "Downtown, where your firm rents the entire 3rd floor?" The color drained from Derek's face. The Meridian office complex was a prestigious address. It's a kind of building that appeared on law firm letterheads as a symbol of success and stability. His firm paid nearly $15,000 a month for their space there. And Derek had often bragged about their prime location in the heart of Columbus's legal district. "You're telling me that for the past year and a half, I've been writing rent checks to you?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Technically, you've been writing them to Meridian Property Management, which is one of my companies," I clarified. "But yes, ultimately that money comes to me." Emma was staring at Derek with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite anger, but it was something close to disappointment. "Derek, do you remember last month when you were complaining about the building's management company being too responsive to tenant requests? You said whoever owned the place must be some kind of pushover." Derek's jaw tightened, and I could see him trying to process this new information while maintaining some semblance of his usual composure. "That was just a casual observation about property management styles," he said stiffly. "Got, you called them?" "Unprofessional for fixing the air conditioning so quickly," Emma continued. "Gosh. You said any landlord who responded to maintenance requests within 24 hours was probably desperate for tenants and didn't understand basic business principles." Mom was watching this exchange with fascination, as if she was seeing Derek clearly for the first time. "You criticized Jake's business practices without knowing they were Jake's business practices." I didn't know, Derek said defensively, but his usual smooth delivery was gone. "How could I possibly have known? Jake never mentioned owning property. Never talked about being a landlord. He shows up to family events looking like he shops at thrift stores." "I shop at thrift stores because I like finding unique pieces," I said calmly. "Not because I can't afford new clothes. Some of my favorite shirts cost $3 at Goodwill. Why would I pay $50 for something mass-produced when I can find something with character for almost nothing?" Derek turned to Emma, and there was something almost desperate in his expression. "Emma, you have to admit this is bizarre. What kind of person hides this level of success from their own family? It's not normal behavior." "What's not normal?" Emma said, her voice carrying a new edge, "is the way you've been talking about my brother for 2 years. Every family gathering, every holiday. You've made little comments about his lack of direction and his need to grow up and face reality. You've offered to help him find work like he was some kind of project you needed to fix." "I was trying to be helpful," Derek protested. "Based on the information I had, it seemed like Jake was struggling. I was offering genuine assistance." "You were being condescending," Dad said suddenly, his voice sharp. "I may not have understood what my son was doing, but I never talked down to him the way you have. I never treated him like he was broken." The accusation hit Derek like a physical blow. He prided himself on his social skills, his ability to read people and situations. The idea that he'd been consistently misjudging someone for years was clearly difficult for him to accept. "Look," Derek said, attempting to regain his composure, "I admit I may have misjudged the situation. But you have to understand, Jake's behavior has been misleading. He deliberately created a false impression about his circumstances." "No," I said firmly. "I just didn't broadcast my financial situation to people who hadn't earned the right to know about it. There's a difference between being private and being deceptive." Derek's face flushed red, and I could see his temper starting to flare. This was the side of him that Emma rarely saw, the side that came out when he felt challenged or embarrassed. "This is ridiculous. You let me make suggestions about your career for months? You sat there and nodded while I talked about entry-level positions and networking opportunities. If that's not deceptive, I don't know what is." "I was being polite," I replied. "It's the same way I'm being polite now by not pointing out that your firm's lease agreement includes a clause about professional conduct that you might want to review." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Derek understood immediately that his position was far more precarious than he'd realized. Not only had he been unknowingly antagonizing his landlord, but he'd been doing it in front of witnesses who could attest to his pattern of disrespectful behavior. Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," she announced, heading toward the back door that led to Mom's small garden. After a moment's hesitation, she turned back to Derek. "Maybe you should go home tonight. I think we all need some time to process this." "Emma, wait," Derek said, rising to follow her. "We can talk about this rationally. There's no need to make any hasty decisions." But Emma was already outside and through the window. I could see her standing among Mom's rose bushes with her arms wrapped around herself. Derek hesitated at the door, clearly torn between following her and trying to salvage the situation. "Inside, Derek," Mom said quietly. "I think maybe you should listen to Emma." He looked around the table one more time, his eyes settling on me with an expression that mixed resentment with something that might have been grudging respect. "This conversation isn't over, Jake." "Actually," I said, meeting his gaze steadily, "I think it is." Derek left without another word, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood as he walked to the front door. The sound of his car starting and pulling away seemed to lift a weight from the house, like a storm cloud finally moving on after hours of threatening rain. Emma came back inside a few minutes later, her eyes red, but her posture straighter than I'd seen it all evening. She sat down at the table and looked directly at me. "I owe you an apology, Jake, not just for tonight, but for years of assumptions. I let Derek influence how I saw you, and I should have known better." Dad cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "Son, I don't know how to fix the damage I've done. All those years of thinking you needed saving when you were the one. Saving us? We don't need to fix anything overnight," I said, "but maybe we can start being honest with each other. All of us." Mom reached across the table and took my hand. "Can you forgive us for not seeing who you really are?" "I can forgive you for being human," I replied. "If you can forgive me for being so stubborn that I'd rather prove a point than trust my own family." 6 months later, Emma broke up with Derek for good. She started asking real questions about my business and even invested in one of my properties. Dad still brags about his kids, but now he tells people about his son, the real estate entrepreneur, with the same pride he shows for his daughter, the lawyer. The house on Maple Street still creaks in all the familiar places, but the conversations around the dinner table sound completely different. We talk about actual problems now instead of dancing around them. We celebrate real victories instead of manufactured ones. Every month, when Mom writes the rent check, she signs it with a smile, knowing exactly where it's going. Sometimes the best family dinners happen after you clear the air. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.